Good afternoon, I'm Amy Ghani, and thanks for tuning in to NTV7's 2014 budget program. Now, in just approximately half an hour, we'll be broadcasting the keenly awaited budget speech by Prime Minister Datuk Seri Najib Tun Razak live from Parliament. And following the announcement, we'll be talking to a panel of experts for a more in-depth analysis. All these and much more, so stay tuned. The time has come again for the government to unveil its budget for the upcoming year. Now, the 2014 budget, themed Fulfilling Promises, Accelerating Transformation, is expected to include some form of incentives to benefit the low to middle income groups. But at the same time, it's also expected to embark on bold fiscal reforms and economic restructuring that might prove to be unpopular but necessary for the long-term good of the country's economy. Now, pressure has undoubtedly piled on Putrajaya to trim the country's debt level and introduce meaningful reforms to increase the government's income, especially after global credit ratings agency Fitch cut the country's debt outlook from stable to negative in July. Now, Malaysia's fiscal deficit has been shrinking since 2009. And as of last year, Malaysia's budget deficit stood at 4.5% of GDP, the second highest in emerging markets after India. But the government looks set to achieve its target of 4% this year as domestic demand holds up and exports recover. Now, by next year, the government aims to reach a 3.5% deficit and 3% in 2015 before eventually achieving a balanced budget by 2020. Now, obtaining these goals is important, particularly at a time when government finances are under much public scrutiny. Now, with the global economy showing a slower recovery, Malaysia has been urged to accelerate structural reforms to ensure the country's economy remains diversified. Now, some of the options the government is considering include scaling back some large projects with high import content, increasing the country's economic competitiveness, and diversifying its export markets.
Many economists say the government needs to implement some bold measures to overcome the deficit and that there should be no more delay in the structural adjustment and reform plans.
I don't mean that we are not doing structural reform at all. We are doing it, but at amount or speed that is still not enough.
Taxan Malaysia, meanwhile, suggested measures that would be able to reduce the annual budget deficit.
So I think that there are three ways. One is you look at subsidy rationalization, savings, you help the low income, but you still have a balance left, which helps the government. Secondly, you look at value for money projects, look at all, in other words, even the tendering for every project may well be the answer, open tenders, right? We still haven't got that yet. And then the third one is really looking at sequencing your projects. Just do the more important ones first, and the rest you defer. So in that way, you can easily manage your expenditure.
Malaysians have long been dependent on subsidies, which keep prices of goods and services at artificial levels. Now, as a result, the subsidy bill has been swelling over the years to maintain these prices. Now, of course, as we all know, the government in September cut fuel subsidies for the first time in nearly 2 years to save about 3.3 billion ringgit annually as part of crucial budget reforms. Now, as it is, the government is expected to spend about 37.6 billion ringgit on subsidies this year. But just to recap, in 2012, the government spent some 42.4 billion ringgit on subsidies. Of this total, 24.8 billion ringgit went towards subsidizing fuel, 1.6 billion for cooking oil, 528 million for rice, 513 million for sugar, and 150 million for flour subsidies, and the rest for social welfare programs.
According to the Performance Management and Delivery Unit Pemandu, Malaysia is one of the most subsidized nations in the world, with a subsidy bill amounting to 74 billion ringgit in 2009. And the debt is growing at 12% annually, with most of the borrowed money spent on operational expenditure such as subsidies instead of investing the cash. In 2010, the government has introduced a subsidy rationalization plan, but it has not been followed through due to various reasons.
Certain subsidy system is good, but certain are to be outdated. Things like, for example, petrol. But the problem is actually the richer driving the more expensive cars and consume more petrol, but they got the most subsidies. Whereas the poor, the general base of the population, don't enjoy that much, you see.
Ianya harus mengambil 3 perkara. Satu, supaya sasarannya benar-benar sampai. Golongan yang menikmatinya ialah golongan yang disasarkan itu. Teladan yang boleh digunakan ialah negara-negara Skandinavia yang saya maksudkan tadi, ya. Yang merupakan juga negara kebajikan yang berjaya, yang mempunyai pendapatan yang tinggi, antara yang tertinggi di dunia.
Many argue that the middle income group, which was frequently overlooked by the government, should also be included in social policies.
A focus on middle income group. This is the group which is too rich to get assistance from the government in terms of BRIM and so forth. They would not get it because they are a little bit too rich, but they are not rich enough to beat the cost of living especially in urban centers.
Some analysts commented that other ways should also be considered by the government to help those in need instead of opting for cash aids.
Because I think if you give cash to people, there is a tendency to use the cash for the purchases of not on necessities basically. They can use it to buy alcohol or tobaccos and so forth, and also there's something which in other countries what they do is they give food vouchers, for instance, rebates, for instance, on medical expenses and so forth. It's something which I think that our government can emulate.
All right, so now let's switch gears a little and take a snapshot view of the current Malaysian economic landscape. Now, looking at the growth trajectory since 2009, at a glance, there's a notable spike over here. And really what happened was the domestic economy experienced the full impact of the global recession in the first quarter of 2009, with GDP declining by 6.2%. But the combination of fiscal measures and accommodative monetary environment and measures introduced for continued access to financing contributed to the stabilization of the domestic economy in the second quarter and the subsequent recovery in the second half of the year. Now, moving along the trend line in 2012, the economy expanded by 5.6%. Now, for this year, Malaysia's growth averaged at 4.2% for the first 2 quarters, despite the really challenging global environment. Now, results for the third quarter growth will be released on November 15th. Now, going forward, the prolonged weakness in the external environment could affect Malaysia's overall growth momentum, but this is a phenomenon that's not unique to Malaysia. In fact, growth in several economies in Asia, especially those that are more export-oriented, have also shown some signs of slowing down. Nevertheless, for this year, GDP is projected to remain in the range of 4.5 to 5%, with domestic demand continuing to be supportive for growth. All right, now in terms of inflation, a much talked about topic following the recent fuel price adjustments, let's look at what's going on over here. Now, inflationary pressures moderated substantially in 2009, and this can be attributed to a couple of prominent factors. Aside from a base effect of higher inflation in the previous year, on the external front, there was a drop in global commodity prices, especially for crude oil, which plummeted by more than 60% in January of 2009. Now, on the domestic front, the marked decline in inflation was in line with a slowdown in economic activity and generally resulting from the spillovers from the global financial crisis. So moving along over the trend line, just to recap for last year in 2012, inflation averaged at 1.6%. Now, during the first 8 months of this year, however, inflation averaged at 1.7%, and this was driven mainly by higher food prices and higher rental. But for 2013 as a whole, headline inflation is expected to remain within the projected range of 2 to 3%. Now, there has been a lot of talk on the implementation of the Goods and Services Tax, or GST, with many predicting that it will be included in the 2014 budget. Now, Putrajaya has estimated that a 4% GST could contribute 1 billion ringgit annually in revenue and would reduce dependency on state oil firm Petronas. But many are skeptical as to whether this 4% will create an effective alternative tax base needed to ease the ballooning budget deficit. Now, more than 160 countries worldwide have already introduced GST, or value-added tax, VAT, as it's known in European countries. All right, now let's take a look at the rates in some Asian countries, just to compare. Now, Singapore introduced GST in 1994 at a rate of 3%. Now, the current rate is 7%. Philippines' rate, on the other hand, is at 12%, while China at 17%. Now, of course, in most European countries, VAT has long been in the double digits, with the exception of Switzerland, which has a rate of 8%. Now, for the UK, the VAT has gradually risen 10% in the 1970s to the current rate of 20%. But just to note, the GST, if included in the upcoming budget, would only take effect earliest in 2015.
Analysts expect a 4% GST to result in the consumer price index increasing by a half percentage point. They say if the rate is 5%, then there could be a 1.2% increase, while a rate of 6% will see a rise of 1.9%. Now, some quarters say if it is to be implemented, the government needs to provide assistance to the urban middle class to cushion them from a drop in their living standards.
Pekerja sebagai rakyat sekarang ini menganggap bahawa adakah kita melihat bahawa kemasukan pendapatan kerajaan harus juga menggunakan bahawa rakyat harus membayar. Rakyat telah membayar cukai pendapatan, ya, dan juga membayar cukai-cukai servis tertentu.
But most economists see the GST as a panacea to the persistent deficit and increasing debt.
In my opinion, we should introduce it even back to 10 years ago, when external factor is actually more conducive. We don't have a challenge from the disaster from other regions, and while our growth is still good.
On the bright side, when GST is implemented, Malaysians no longer need to pay the existing sales tax of between 5 and 10% and the service tax of 6%. It would also generate additional revenue of between 5 to 10 billion ringgit. When this happens, the government may be in the position to reduce personal and corporate taxes.
All right, so let's see what's happening right now in Parliament, where we have our reporter, Melissa Ong, on standby. Let's see what she has to say. Hi, Mel. What do you have for us?
Hi, Amy. Well, the Parliament is now abuzz with media personnel and also members of Parliament. And just about 2 minutes ago, Prime Minister Datuk Seri Najib Tun Razak arrived at the Parliament lobby, clad in orange baju Melayu. Well, everyone is excited to know the 2014 budget roll and see if it's befitting to the budget, to this year's theme, which is fulfilling promises, accelerating transformation. Ultimately, the aim of the budget 2014 is to enhance the nation's competitiveness through highly value-added economic activities, while also taking care of the public's well-being. Now, here with me is Youth and Sports Minister YB Kari Jamaluddin, who will share his thoughts on this year's budget. So, YB, thank you for joining NTV7. What are your plans for your ministry and the allocation that you're expecting for your ministry?
Obviously, all ministries are hoping for a higher allocation. We've all got our plans, but we also understand that the government's faced with a situation having to reduce the fiscal deficit. This is absolutely critical for us to send the right messages to the international investment community that fiscal prudence is the order of the day. Having said that, my own ministry, we've put in a request for additional funding for skills development. National Youth Skills Training Centres under us, IKBNs, we've got 20. PM's asked us to expand enrollment and increase the quality of teaching there as well. Big push on vocational technical education. So we requested for quite a bit of funds for skills and vocational training through KBS, as well as youth development programs which are ongoing, which we've fine-tuned so that they're more relevant to young people today. And of course, sports facilities. Everyone wants a futsal court, everyone wants a sepak takraw court, badminton arena. So I get requests from people all the time, all over the country. So these are things that we've requested also for the development budget.
Well, also the middle income earners are often crying out for assistance. So do you think that the government will address their grievances in this budget?
Well, it's important that we try to mitigate some of the cost of living issues, especially for middle income earners. And I think some of the things that the government can do in a restricted fiscal environment is to try and ensure that some of the things such as housing, especially in urban areas, public transport, and some income support for the low middle income earners can be addressed. Of course, the big question is GST and whether or not that's going to be announced, and if that's announced, whether or not there's going to be a corresponding reduction in income tax. That may happen this year, that may happen next year or a couple of years. But I think the Prime Minister is extremely cognizant of the fact that middle income earners are being squeezed by a higher cost of living. That's why the government wants to come in as far as public amenities are concerned, infrastructure, housing, transport, some income support, and also accessible goods that are easily accessed, which are priced fairly.
Okay. Thank you so much, YB, for joining NTV7. Well, I also have with me MP Lembah Pantai, YB Nurul Izzah. So, YB, my first question to you is further subsidy rationalisation could be expected to ease the burden of the government coffers. So, what do you think of this unpopular but necessary move?
I think it's very important to consider, in light of the findings by the Auditor General's report, the issue of rationalisation of wastages. I think that's why we are looking at, if you want to cut subsidies, it's also equally important to look at ministries that walk the talk. And that's why in Pakatan Rakyat's budget, the focus is primarily to have across 10% cut across all ministries, government agencies. For example, the Prime Minister's office, the budget has increased from 7 billion ringgit in the year 08 under Pak Lah to 14.6 billion. Almost more than double in the year 2013. So we'd like this to be the focus where the leaders, start the rationalisation before the rakyat.
Okay, so there are also mixed reactions towards the government's plan to introduce GST. So are you for or against it?
I think it's important to understand, GST is a tool, it's been effective in many countries, but at the end of the day, it is a regressive tax. And we haven't really exhausted all avenues, or any avenue for that matter, to reduce wastages. And once you start on GST, for example, Datuk Seri Idris Jala announced a possible 7% will lead up to 7 billion ringgit in savings. But remember, we lost out about 6.5 billion ringgit through the Auditor General's report, sampling through wastages. So I think it's important to ensure only 10% of the working population pay taxes in this country. We must exhaust all avenues and look at how we contain wastages before implementing such a horrible regressive tax policy, in our view.
Thank you so much, YB, for your time. Thank you. So, some 96 memorandums were submitted covering a wide spectrum of macro, sectoral and also social issues to the Ministry of Finance for consideration. So how far will it be addressed? It will definitely be announced shortly in the budget, and I'm assuming that it will start at 4 p.m. sharp. So I'll be back later to furnish you with more updates. For now, it's back to you, Amy.
All right, thank you, Melissa. That was Melissa Ong live from Parliament. We'll be getting back to her from time to time for more updates. Now, the government is also widely expected to increase the real property gains tax, RPGT, by 15 to 20% in the 2014 budget. And this is done to curb speculation and stabilize house prices in the country. Now, analysts predict the move would impact the property market in the short term, but in the long run, it could help restrain property speculation. Now, in the 2013 budget, the government revised the RPGT to 15% from 10% for properties sold within 2 years. And for properties sold between 2 and 5 years, the rate was revised to 10% from 5%. We're taking a short break now, but don't go away. More to come in just a bit. Yep. So tak payah think. Oh, okay. Tapi betul ke this script punya prompter? So I cakap thank you, welcome back and then terus this one Huh? Oh, is it? Tak faham. Okay, you just prompt me lah. Welcome back. You're watching NTV7's 2014 budget program with me, Amy Ghani. Now, let's take a quick look at the federal government budget for 2013. Now, out of the 251.6 billion ringgit allocation, about 80% was allocated for operating expenditure, and that included spending on subsidies and various financial assistance programs, while the remainder, some 50 billion ringgit, was spent on development expenditure that focused, among others, on transformation initiatives under the ETP, infrastructure projects, education and human capital development programs, and so forth. Now let's get into a little bit more detail and move to the development expenditure, in which we will focus on the social services sector. Now, affordable housing is undoubtedly a much talked about issue, and this was acknowledged in the 2013 budget. We had a PRIMA in which the government allocated 1.9 billion ringgit to build about 123,000 affordable housing units in strategic locations. Now, the initiative aims to build 80,000 houses priced between 100 and 400,000 ringgit per unit. The government also allocated 543 million ringgit for the Project Perumahan Rakyat. Now, these houses will be sold between 30,000 and 40,000 ringgit per unit, much lower than the market price of about 120,000 ringgit per unit. Now, under the My First Home scheme, there was an increase in the income limit for individual loans from 3,000 to 5,000 ringgit per month, or joint loans of husband and wife of up to 10,000 ringgit per month. In healthcare, on the other hand, the government set aside some funds to upgrade 350 clinics nationwide, and there was also an allocation of 20 million ringgit for an additional 70 new One Malaysia clinics. The government also opened 57 Kedai Rakyat One Malaysia in Sabah and Sarawak to ensure the prices of essential goods over there are sold at lower prices. And those were some of the highlights of the 2013 budget for development expenditure. It's time for another quick break, but stay with us. So you will prompt me when the budget starts, right? Okay. Okay.
I drop it just now. So
Tapi nanti the script, okay, tak apalah.
I lupa print on the chair.
Then the script you terus buat dekat, and it looks like the tabling of the budget. Yeah?
Boy ke tak boy?
My chair to the right sikit.
Right, sini.
Betul ke? This right. Okay.
Check. Okay. Nah. Lagi, okay.
That chair pun ke sana sikit. We have 1 minute to go.
Wait.
Okay. Kejap, tengah hook up mic. So you'll prompt me when we're crossing to Parliament. Am I positioned correctly?
How should I sit?
Just cross. I usually do this.
Is it better if I button up or don't button up?
Button. Where do I look? Cam 1, right? Okay.
Do I look at cam 2?
Where does Yin Sin looks at me?
I look at you. Fine. Okay.
Okay, control housing prices first.
Like that. No, like that. How?
Welcome back. You're with me, Amy Ghani, on NTV7's 2014 budget program. Now, interestingly, for this year, the government has provided an online portal which has been up and running at www.onemalaysia.com.my, and many have posted comments on what they would like to be seen addressed on a variety of topics ranging from cost of living and employment to education and social welfare. So let's zoom into a few hot topics that have been brewing, and very shortly we'll find out whether the suggestions were well received by the government. And to discuss this, we have Ng Yin Sin, Senior Vice President of the Asian Strategic and Leadership Institute, ASLI. Welcome. We appreciate your time. All right, Yin Sin. So one of the issues that have been brewing was control housing prices. You know, it remains a thorny issue, and there's a really loud cry within the community to lower house prices, especially in urban areas. What more do you think the government can do on this?
I think what the government can do is that perhaps introduce the RPGT or reintroduce the RPGT to the original rate of 20% for a property purchased and sold within 5 years. That would not only bring down the possibility of speculators from ballooning the market prices,
right,
and that will indirectly or directly hike up the entire property market pricing.
Right.
And then of course it's a Prima One Housing and One Malaysia House efforts and all that by the government that will also help first-time house buyers.
But right now, the current policies that are in place, do you think it's a step forward towards the initiative of reducing or making affordable housing available to young executives and people living in the urban areas?
Well, we have to start somewhere,
right,
and I would say that the One Malaysia initiative, it's something which is, but I would say that the One Malaysia Prima Housing project is a very commendable effort by the government. But certainly, the target of building 1 million affordable houses all over the country within the next 5-10 years, it's a far-fetched target. But again, every policy takes time to sink in and to be implemented.
All right, and let's move on to education. So there has been this very hotly debated issue on abolishing the PT/PTN loan repayments, and there's really two camps. You know, one that's really against it, and these groups are saying it's not fair. You signed a contract that has legal implications. You must pay. And then another group that is for the abolishment. They are more towards free education. They use that as their stance. So, do you agree? And what's your stance on this?
Well, you see, PT/PTN at the very beginning, it's the loan. When you loan something, when you borrow something, logically speaking, there will be a repayment.
Right.
For people who advocate for free education, that is a different story altogether. That's a different policy right from the beginning.
Okay.
A PT/PTN fund was established for people to take the money from their study and then repay. Therefore, the money will be forever going to be there. For the younger generations, for future generations to continue to take study loans from there.
Right.
However, if today we abolish the PT/PTN loan, does that mean that the loan will slowly shrink and then there will no longer be any funds for future people to study? And how are we going to replace and to help people who really want to study to get a loan in the future? For people who advocate for free education, I believe the government is already doing quite well in terms of providing almost free education at the primary and the secondary level.
Right.
And to be honest with you, public universities in Malaysia or the public colleges are not charging a very hefty price to students, and therefore
especially relative to overseas
yes
studies.
exactly therefore PTPTN loan is really necessary to be there to continue to help fund help fund students or even families who need that kind of funding to send their kids for